In terms of like setting up for success, how much do you want to see invested where it's gone into the business, whether it's a startup and they've paid certain vendors, or if it's an acquisition that they've already committed those funds?
I tend to ask my clients to show an investment of 100,000. They don't have to have spent all of it.
Okay.
But I want to try to get to 100,000 in escrow,
All right.
right? And then again, depending on what it is that they're doing, I will try and bolster that saying, well, there's money in case we need to make an additional investment. So for example, for one of the gas station / convenience stores that we did recently, the investment itself wasn't terribly high. I think it was 75,000 actually, but there was a promissory note for 300,000 for the fuel, right? And that was contractual because they had to sign an 8-year contract.
Wow.
So there was that. And then there was all of the vendor contracts for like, your chips and your sodas and whatever. And so I included all of that as a part of the startup cost to show that they had met that threshold. And so I just do it based on whatever type it is to try to see what makes
sense for the business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And have you seen many cases where there's multiple foreign nationals all getting the E2 visa in the same business?
Yes, but then again, USCIS and the consulates tend not to favor that because then you run into that regulatory language that USCIS, understands to mean 51% ownership. Right. And so anytime you have two owners, and I have had this where we've had two owners and I've given each 50%, then we ended up with a request for evidence saying, well, who has control? And so then we literally had to sort of split it between the two, saying, well, they each have 50%. One is operational, one is financial. So they each have control within their respective verticals. Right. So having multiple members, I think just consulates tend to not like it. And again, this consulates are different, right? I mean, you'd send a case like that to a consulate that's very used to it, like Singapore, you'll come out with a very different adjudication than you would out of like Pakistan or Sri Lanka, right? It's all over the place. So structuring this in terms of like knowing what consulate the client's going to go to, what the vertical is that they're investing in. I'm a big proponent of E2s not being like a cut, copy, paste situation. Like you really have to work from the ground level and build it up for that specific vertical and that specific consulate.
It sounds like it's pretty similar with the O1 visa and a lot of these visa categories that you work with, where it's really quite customized.
Yeah, but again, I think the franchise, and I work with investors from, let's say, MENA and South Asia who are very, very familiar with being entrepreneurs. And so they want to do, a business from the ground up themselves. And I always caution them. And I've always said, I think my preference is franchise for the simple reason that business is done very, very differently in the US compared to MENA and Asia. You're required to invest a substantial amount, which has never been defined by regulation. But then there's also part 2, right? Once you make the investment and you're running the business, your income cannot be marginal, right? So in terms of understanding how business is done and how business is operated, what works in the US or what worked for you in Asia and MENA or Africa or wherever may not necessarily work in the US because it's a completely different culture, completely different business mindset, right? So I think having a franchise is humongously helpful, at least for my clients, because they at least get some form of training and support as they start out. And again, my clients initially will, they'll start with one and then they'll go off into different directions.